Johnny found out that I had this meeting scheduled and was furious at me. It was not very long before I was being accused of full-on having this other plan to sleep with the writer.
I'll look at how Hurt continues to portray Depp as the bad guy, but as I'll show, there are signs of deception in her statements. In this video, I'll use statement and conversation analysis. These are both highly detailed linguistic methods. Before we start, it's important to note the common foundation of both methods, that the brain wants to tell the truth, even if people don't. The brain contains experiential memory, and it's next to impossible to completely suppress this experiential memory. That's why we examine the little bits and pieces of a subject's language to find inconsistencies and patterns. These inconsistencies and patterns point to what the subjects actually experienced and how he or she actually feels. You can find the links to my previous videos about this case in the description. If you're new and find language exciting, please subscribe for more videos like this. And if you like the video, please press the like button. It helps me out when you do that.
All right, now I'm going to stay in November of 2014. And did there come a time that Mr. Depp told you that he understood that you were not going to accept any more jobs, that you were going to stop working?
Hurt tries to spin this question to her benefit.
Well, Johnny said this to me in an argument, in a fit of rage is the best way I can describe it, and kind of alluded to me having agreed to not work anymore, which if you don't know me, is preposterous. There's no way I would agree to that. Although I did make concessions and gave up a lot of
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay.
That wasn't
overruled.
Thank you.
Hurt's repeated self-repairs are hesitation markers.
In an argument,
Clearly, she's having trouble finding the right words to portray Depp in the worst light possible. After choosing the noun argument, she decides it's not strong enough and continues with self-repairs until she adds the words in a fit of rage.
In a fit of rage.
Now the self-repairs stop, so we know that she's content with this modification. However, the words she chooses next indicate uncertainty and don't line up with the strong words, fit of rage. The words,
it's the best way I can describe it,
indicate that Hurt knows there are other ways to describe it. This detracts from having a fit.
And kind of alluded to me having agreed.
Kind of is a hitch. Hitches express equivocation. Equivocation gives the subject leeway in case they wish to modify or change the statements at a later point. In this context, the hitch shows that either Depp's alleged allusion was a minor part of the argument, or he didn't allude to it at all. Also, it's important to keep in mind that a passage like this doesn't imply any illegal activity on Depp's part. It's not a crime to allude to something in an argument. The only reason Hurt and her defense team bring it up is to prime the jury members to think that Depp is a bad guy, as the stereotypical controlling partner who's standing in the way of the other partner's wishes. Hurt makes so-called dramatic pauses. She makes sure that we hear her heavy breaths and to look offended.
Which, if you don't know me,
her pause before the adjective
is preposterous.
Also underlines how much she supposedly means it. She says there's no way she would agree to stop working, which is a strong stance before she then portrays herself as diplomatic.
Although I did make concessions.
She wrinkles her nose on several occasions. This shows anger, which apparently is right beneath the surface of her humble and well-meaning facial expressions. These signs of anger could be intentional, to show the jury that she has bottled up emotions. This would make it seem all the more admirable that she's even able to take the stand. Unlike when Depp was on the stand, Hurt doesn't just narrate, her language is restricted. She's clearly worried about what the jury thinks about what she says. This is deeper than the ordinary fear of losing a trial. We saw her calm and careless demeanor in the deposition. In this trial, Hurt's worried about the narratives themselves, the words themselves. Next, we should note her fragmented and ambiguous narrative.
Please continue.
So he reached out to other people and to me to that effect, furious at me for taking meetings. There was one in particular I wanted, one meeting I wanted to take because it was a project in development with a sci-fi writer. And I remember I wanted to take that. These things were just, they were just constant fights. But in between them, when things were good between Johnny and I, he would be, he would word it to me like, I'm trying to look out for you. You say that you don't want to be objectified, but you're doing it to yourself. But at first it was because I dressed a certain way, and then it just got more narrow and more narrow and more narrow what I could do without being the blame for why the industry, Hollywood, the entertainment industry, was putting me in a box and objectifying me. So it became my fault. I mean, I believed it. I believed it. I adopted a lot of these changes myself, not because Johnny, said you have to do it this way, but because of all the other things that he said and did, I eventually found myself making decisions about my own career, about how I dressed, about how I wore my hair, how I presented, where my eyes were cast when I walked into a room. And I believe those were my own decisions.
Hurt struggles with the structure of events and which events to emphasize.
In between them, when things were good between Johnny and I, he would be, he would word it to me like...
This is a strong indication that what she's saying is at odds with her experiential memory, that she didn't actually experience or feel these things at the time, but is only saying them now for self-interest. On the one hand, she continues to portray Depp as the stereotypical controlling spouse who kept putting more and more limitations on what she could do without being blamed, and who influenced her to see things his way. This is a far cry from the tape recordings we've heard. On these recordings, it was very clear that Depp was the calmer and likely more sensitive of the two. It seems unlikely that Depp was in a position to influence her psychologically, because by her own admission, she was raised to not show fear or emotion. On the other hand, she actually agrees with what Depp allegedly said. In a matter-of-fact way, she admits that the industry actually put her in a box. She even says that Depp didn't tell her to do things this way. Also, she unwillingly admits to being cunning, how she wore her hair, and notably where her eyes were cast when she walked into the room. She's revealing the strategies she's using in this trial too, trying to convince or manipulate every single jury member. Next, the negative portrayals of Depp continue. And again, these portrayals have no significance to the case other than painting him in a bad light. Again, this is a method that attorneys use to prime the jury. It's the same as headlines in newspapers or on TV. Many to most people only remember headlines, and headlines are often dramatic, inaccurate, or one-sided. Media companies know this, and they use this knowledge to prime their target audience into believing their agenda. In the following, we should note two things. 1. Hurt places vowel stress on the key verb in her narrative. This is pathos, which is appeal to emotion. In this case, appealing to the jury to be equally offended by Depp's alleged out-of-control behavior. 2. After the narrative, her attorney waits a few seconds before saying anything. Ideally, from the defense team's point of view, this adds to the impact of the narrative.
So tell us about the couples therapy in November 2014.
So Dr. Cowan, this man who is friends with Kipper, who's treating me, agreed to see Johnny and I together. And I don't know how many minutes of that went on before Johnny stormed out knocked something off the table on his way out and rolled a joint in the bathroom before storming out of the office, slamming the door.
It's the same with hosts. A host like Dr. Phil often waits a few seconds before responding to one of the guest's sad stories in order to add to the impact of said story. The producers then turn up the volume so that the silence in the studio is enhanced. Hopefully, from their perspective, this will make the viewers empathize with the guest. Next, Hurt hammers the point about Depp being the stereotypical, controlling and jealous partner standing in the way of her dreams. And she continues with her unreliable dramatizations of what she's saying. These dramatizations are there to underline her testimony, but they end up damaging it. She ends up looking like someone who's aware of sounding sad and scared, rather than actually re-experiencing feelings of sadness or fear. The fear she's been raised not to feel, allegedly.
All right, so I'm going to take you up to December of 2014, and specifically December 17, 2014. And I'm going to ask you to take what, if anything, do you recall of an incident with Mr. Depp relating to Clive Barker?
He was the sci-fi writer that I liked. Well, fantasy sci-fi writer. I kind of had a dream project based on a book that I loved of this author. He's just a weirdo genius, artist, writer. And I had a meeting with him through another director about a piece of property he wanted to make into a movie. And I just remember I believe we were at the ECB. It was in December of 2014 when Johnny found out that I had this meeting scheduled, and was furious at me. Accused me of having this plan to sleep with this. He was mad that I was taking the meeting at this man's house, but the man was very ill, like terminally ill, and not able to leave his bed or his home. He was under home care and very ill. And the person who was introducing us explained to me how we had to meet, and I did. And that was a big problem for Johnny.
Once again, we observe the verb remember. She's used this verb repeatedly in the previous passages. Here it refers back to her attorney's question about what she recalls. Thus, it's already presupposed that what she's saying is what she remembers, and thus, there's no need to keep repeating it. What the inclusion of the verb indicates, however, is that Hurt's not fully invested in the narrative. Again, she doesn't just narrate. Remember refers to Hurt in the courtroom, not Hurt in the narrative. And furthermore, she says it at a point where she doesn't know how to continue.
And I just remember...
She prefaces the verb with the dependent adverb, just. Dependent means that the subject's comparing two thoughts, but here we only get to hear one of them. Unwillingly, Hurt herself makes the I just remember clause sound overly simplifying, and I believe her. It is most likely overly simplified. There are so-called breakers in Hurt's narrative. A breaker is unnecessary language meant to buy the subject additional time to think about what to say. We hear a breaker after the I just remember clause, where she stops the narrative flow by wondering where they were and when.
I just remember I believe we were at the ECB. It was in December of 2014 when...
This again points to sensitivity around what she supposedly just remembers. Statement analysis operates with the term narrative balance when determining whether or not a narrative is reliable. A narrative consists of a prologue, a critical event, and an aftermath. The prologue sets the scene for the critical event and should be short. The critical event is the most important part since it's the main event. It should be long and, more importantly, detailed and consistent. The aftermath briefly explains the outcome of the critical event. In her narrative, there's a mismatch between prologue and critical event. She spends a long time on the prologue describing her dream project, the writer she was about to meet and how sick he was, and again where they were and when. In this passage, all she's able to say with any relevance to what she was asked about is that Depp was furious with her, which is general and not even the main focus, even though it's the critical event. The part that should list the bad things Depp allegedly said or did. She's dragging out her answer, looking for the right words. In the following, this pattern continues. She continues with the breakers about how sweet she initially thought Depp's concern was, and also Depp's alleged drinking.
First, it was that he was concerned about my safety, and I thought that was sweet. And, you know, there is something that I thought was sweet and romantic about that. But combined with the drinking, it was not very long before I was being accused of full-on having this other plan to sleep with the writer in order to get this part that I was already being, you know, basically offered to develop. And it was just this.
The hesitation, prolonging, and narrative imbalance all indicate that Heard's not speaking from experiential memory, or, at the very least, entirely from experiential memory. Notice how she skips steps in her narrative and chooses concluding language instead. Unwillingly, she points to this herself when saying,
It was not very long before I was being accused of.
And even this concluding statement is full of micropauses, pauses under 2 seconds. Also, there's no agency in this sentence. She's about to say that he accused her, but through self-repair, she ends up with the generic it and using passive voice, I was being accused. Thus, it would be interesting to know if this event even took place, or if it did take place, if it truly happened the way she describes it. Because her language points to the established fact that she's remarkably self-aware, aware of the people she's trying to persuade, and aware of dramatizing events. Next, she finally brings herself to say he, but notice how she struggles with providing details about Depp's alleged suspicions. She relies on disgusted facial expressions and excessive hand gestures. Obviously, what she's saying causes internal stress, and one can only speculate as to why that is.
In order to get this part that I was already being, you know, basically offered to develop, and it was just this, you know, he switched from he was accusing me of having this ulterior motive with this director, the director having it with me, then with this writer, and the important thing I can try to get across in this moment is that nothing I said, no amount of explaining, apologizing, accepting, not accepting, agreeing to not go, nothing worked, nothing changed. How mad he was at me and constantly telling me I had done something wrong to deserve what was happening.
She quickly stops trying to give specific examples. Instead, she again prefers concluding language.
This writer and the important thing I can try to get across in this moment is that nothing I said.
These are aftermath descriptions, aftermath rationalizations. The critical event is almost non-existent in her narrative, and she took a long time to even get to the part about Depp being furious, as she put it. She's used the associating expression, you know, numerous times while looking at the jury. You know shows awareness of the people she's trying to persuade, and in its root meaning, this expression assumes shared knowledge, that the jury members know or should know that what she's saying is true. Opposite of its linguistic purpose, however, it actually makes what she says sound more uncertain. Next, notice how she skips logical steps in the narrative and seeks to conclude rather than describe.
Until, of course, he takes it too far, hits me too hard, breaks too many things in the house, and then leaves, which was the pattern. And he would leave and not have to deal with the cleanup.
These are dramatic events, dramatic accusations that she doesn't seem to want to detail. Not because it brings back bad memories and is hard for her to talk about, but because she can't actually describe specific events. She says,
which was the pattern.
Instead of detailing the specific event, she rushes to describe patterns. Next, Hurt concludes by taking on the role of the one who was wronged, and she does so with an unusually long aftermath, which adds to the narrative imbalance.
He never had to deal with the cleanup. He never had to deal with the destruction or see me or the house that he had destroyed. He never had to deal with my face the next day. He would just go. I called it splitting. He just split. And eventually I'd get an apology of some kind, or I would get an offer to have him come over. He would offer to come over and talk or give me my peace or give me my goodbye. And in many ways, I found myself accepting that, knowing it was kind of false pretense, because I too wanted to resolve it. I didn't want him to think I was sleeping with this sci-fi writer. Part of me really wanted to believe that he didn't mean those things, and I wanted to get to that part of him that would tell me he didn't mean what he said and that he was acting this way because he was messed up, you know. And the cycle would repeat, I suppose.
She acts like she's invested in the storytelling, but she's not. Previously, she managed to sneak in the attack on Depp that he was drinking, and now she manages to sneak in a presupposition that Depp is in fact messed up. The language has pointed to this all along. She's so concerned with sounding like a victim that she ends up not sounding like a victim at all. In this last excerpt, notice how she makes sure to put restrictions on her memory. She's asked about a fight she and Depp had, a fight that escalated. People who were involved in such an event are expected to have a clear recollection, but a way to give subjects leeway to modify or even change their statements at a later point is to make them use equivocating language, and this is what the attorney lets her do here.
I don't really remember what happened in that fight. I remember more afterwards. I remember how apologetic he was for it. I remember him telling me he took it too far. I remember him saying he'd never do it again. And I remember wanting to get to Christmas. You know, Christmases are hard probably for everyone. And I remember it was close enough to Christmas that I was tired. And I wanted to be in a I wanted to be in a kind, gentle, peaceful state for Christmas. I didn't want to go through a breakup at this time. I didn't want to, that's what I remember of that time.
She starts by explicitly stating that she remembers more about what happened after the event than the event itself. This is in line with the narrative imbalance. Here, she's admitting it. Also, the self-portrayal of being insecure and controlled by Depp is inconsistent with her assertive and sometimes deliberately arrogant behavior in the deposition, and her assertive and even condescending statements on the tape recordings. On these recordings, she's quick to call Depp belittling names. That's it for now. See you.